So in this talk I want to cover three things. Firstly, what is neoliberalism? Secondly, why has it been so successful and resilient up to now? And thirdly, how could it break up? Okay, so the term neoliberalism has been in common use since the 1990s. What we now call neoliberalism was called various other things in different countries before then. Neoliberalism has come to be more or less, well, it's come to it's a rather vague term, and sometimes it comes to mean more or less anything that's a bit right-wing. So if you read David Harvey's book, The Brief History of Neoliberalism, which is probably the most widely read book about it on the left, he defines it just as the restoration of class power. That is, it's the ruling classes taking revenge for the reforms which have been extracted from them in the, well, between 1945 and the early 80s. I think that's part of it, but by no means all, and I think it's slightly misleading. There's a huge book published last year called The Handbook of Neoliberalism. What identifies it is the extension of competitive markets into all spheres of society and the economy. And that's a bit nearer to it. But I think, again, that's missing something. So, right, I don't think it's just markets in general. If you look at the process of the emergence of what is now, in hindsight, called neoliberalism in the early 80s, it's a process whereby the governments eventually, almost everywhere, respond to the breakdown of the old regime, the Bretton Woods regime, fixed exchange rates, capital controls and so on, by opening up to the world market. And it's an era of an enormous increase in, particularly in capital flows across borders. So, people sometimes now talk about there being two eras of globalization, one before the First World War and one now. At the high point of globalization, as it's called in hindsight before the First World War, foreign ownings of capital, so capital assets owned in one country, owned by capitalists in another country, the total of those was about 20% of global income. And half of them were owned by British capitalists. 20%. By 1945, that had gone down to 5%. So the total stock of capital, which is situated in one country and owned by a capitalist in another country, is 5% of global income. And then it rises quietly over the next 35 years. By 1980, it's up to 25%, a bit over the pre-World War I figure. And at the time of the crash in 2008, it was 200%. So it's 10 times as big. And it's gone down a bit, but not very much. It's still like 190% of global income. So there's an enormous increase in capital flows. The great majority of countries, not all of them, not China for example, have scrapped capital controls. Capital flows across borders very freely and on a bigger scale and at a bigger speed than ever before. And the other thing that's gone along with that is the globalization of production chains. So that huge numbers of commodities are now produced by a labour process which spans the world. And so you have multinationals which are characteristically rather different from the multinationals in the previous globalization era, who say had oil wells in Iraq and then ship the oil around the world. They're producing laptops like the one there, and its production process will involve a dozen production sites in a dozen different countries. So a huge proportion of world trade increased faster than production from 1945 up to the crash, and a huge proportion of that is trade within the supply networks of individual corporations. It's, it's Apple and its contractors shipping bits across borders. So it's not, so this is something different from just the general extension markets. It's the rise of world markets to the dominant regulator of economic life. This in turn has reshapes the role of governments. Now, at the height of globalisation, there was a lot of talk about this makes governments irrelevant. It doesn't at all. Governments play a very important role in globalisation, but the role of a government in the era of neoliberalism is basically to make its terrain, the country it governs, suitable, attractive for footloose international capital. To make this country a good place, an attractive place for global capital to perch in. That's the fundamental defining role. So, for example, in the whole previous era, a big deal was constructing an integrated industrial base within each country. So, in the 60s, for example, the British government put a lot of effort, completely unsuccessfully, into developing a specifically British computer industry. All across the ex-colonial world, countries wanted to have their own steel industry, so their own steelworks, and that's ceased to be a priority for governments. It's the era of contracting out to privatisation, which is again something more than just the extension of markets, and is linked in with the trends I've talked about, because this is contracting out to privatisation done on a world market scale. So everybody knows about the utilities in Britain are owned by companies, mostly from Europe, but in principle from all over the world. And it's a regime of tax cuts for the rich. So since 1980, the average rate of corporation tax in OECD, which is relatively well-off countries, has halved. It's gone down to half of what it is. It's of the cutting back and marketisation of welfare, not quite the abolition, as I'll explain in a minute. It's of the deregulation and, well, not quite deregulation, the re-regulation of labour markets to make them, as from the point of view of capital, flexible. The British example, where there's a whole lot of anti-union laws, is actually not typical of neoliberalism on a world scale, but everywhere there's the removal of labour protections. And it's also the era of the rise of pseudo-markets to regulate what can't be regulated by labour markets. And one sphere where you see that on a huge scale is in education. I mean, there are pretty much at the back of the Thatcher era, some of the Tories wanted to replace the state education system by a system of vouchers. So you get a voucher and you can buy an education where you want. Nowhere on a large scale has done that. But what you have is, on a very large scale in the USA, and increasingly here, is the creation of a pseudo-market in education, where things like league tables, exam scores and so on function as substitute for market signals. Okay, so now, if that picture of the evolution of neoliberalism is right, that tells us various things. It tells us it's not just a policy or an ideology, it's a world regime. So for each government, neoliberalism confronts it as not just here's a set of ideas you might like to choose, there's another one. It's the environment within which that government lives. It's a fixed feature, it's a feature of the world around them, not just of what they think. And it does mean that it's not exactly the same as the free market everywhere. And it's not just one model. If you, one of the things I discuss in my book is the experience of the Workers' Party of Brazil. The Workers' Party of Brazil has its period of power, which has just ended. And in that period, it actually expands welfare in Brazil quite a lot, but entirely within a neoliberal model. It's able to do that because of the Brazilian economy is doing quite well, it all collapsed in the crisis, but it's not, neoliberalism doesn't come in just one variety, and one of the things a neoliberal government does is it has sufficient social infrastructure that capitalists are going to be happy to put their investments there. Okay, that tells us some features. That all tells us, I think, something of why it's been so resilient. And it's worth just standing back and sort of being astonished for a while about how resilient it is. Perry Anderson, in an essay a while back, said neoliberalism is the most successful ideology in world history. So, more successful than Islam, Christianity, the official ideology of the Roman Empire, the most successful ideology in world history. It's on world socialism conference. So we will be the next most successful. But, where it's become the orthodoxy in virtually every, not all, but virtually every country all over the world. And I suggest that's not because of the huge convincing power of the ideology. And I think you can become snared with it by thinking it is that, everybody's neoliberal, what's the point, nobody will listen to any arguments against it. A lot of propositions of neoliberalism have been unpopular pretty much all the way through. Privatization's only ever been popular for limited periods in a few countries. However, it is, for each government, neoliberalism confronts it as a world regime, and generally for the citizen, neoliberalism confronts it as the range of options, as a defining feature of the range of political options. You can have, slightly left neoliberalism or slightly right neoliberalism, but that's it. It was enforced in many countries initially. In Britain it took the Thatcher regime, defeated the miners and so on. In a lot of countries it was imposed first by IMF structural adjustment programs in the 1980s and 1990s. However, it's also the fact that those countries that had neoliberalism imposed by the structural adjustment programs, once they're out of them, virtually none of them reverse track. So Brazil, when the Workers' Party comes to them, they modify neoliberalism quite a lot, but they don't change the fundamental parameters at all. And that, I think, explains why it was so resilient in the face of the crisis. If you go back to 2008, the Financial Times responded by running a series on the future of capitalism. Is it going to survive? What's going to happen now? Is there going to be a huge upswelling of socialist globalizations? You find the chief ideologues of neoliberalism, people like Eugene Farmer and Robert Lucas, are asked, what do you make of this? And they say, well, don't know, mate, you know, I think he's just going to explain this. Literally, they say that. And there's a lot of comments, you know, including the mainstream press, say, well, whatever happens as a result of this, neoliberalism is finished. By June 2010, there's the third G20 summit of the crisis period, and fundamentally, the G20 countries meet in Toronto and say, okay guys, immediate panic over, get back to neoliberalism. And they do. They do. And I think the reason why it proved to have this resilience is to do with it being not just a policy, not just an ideology, not just the choice of an individual government, but a world regime. Okay. Well, does that mean it's invincible? Well, it's certainly not invincible from the left, as I said. One of the misleading things, I think, of thinking of neoliberalism as primarily an ideology or policy is you think, gosh, it must be very populist. Not true, not true. A lot of fundamental precepts of neoliberalism have been unpopular all the way through. And it would tell you that a socialist revolt against neoliberalism would have small chances of victory if it was in a single country. But that has always been our view as socialists, as revolutionists, Marxists. That's always been our view of socialism, that it can't be done country by country, that to even make a beginnings on the building of socialism, you need a terrain of a much larger scale. And that's not become any more difficult or any more impossible as a result of neoliberalism. However, it hasn't happened yet. And does that mean that neoliberalism is invulnerable? No, because I think what we are seeing now is the prospect of a breakup of neoliberalism from the right. If you look at left-wing publications over the last 20 odd years, sometimes anti-neoliberalism is used as a synonym for everything left-wing. It's used as a synonym for anti-capitalism. I think one important thing we have to register is that neoliberalism isn't the only species of capitalism, and it's not necessarily the worst either. So, the shock we've had in Britain is the Brexit vote. Now, I think that was a very significant shift to the right. However, in and of itself, doesn't promise to disrupt neoliberalism particularly at all, because everybody in the Tory party is from different angles, but they're all quite clear. They want a Britain immersed in the world markets. They just want it reinserted in the world markets in a different way. And some of them, in fact, the right-wing Tory party, want a Britain which is sort of much more brutally and straightforwardly neoliberal than you have at the moment. So it's not necessarily a breakup of neoliberalism. In France, we had the very high vote, eventually defeat of Marine Le Pen in the presidential election, which raises questions about, next time round, who knows what will happen. Now, that's very alarming and important development. Whether it actually would break up neoliberalism rather than making it uglier, again, is quite an open question. The Front National is quite statist in its rhetoric at the moment, but what would it do if it were in government? Well, not necessarily stick to that, because actually it spent most of its political career being its economic policy, not its policy on on everything, being proud of being neoliberal. So Jean-Marie Le Pen the father of Marine Le Pen, the previous leader of the National Front, used to boast that he was the person who introduced Reagan's ideas into France. That was his boast. Right. So, there are quite big shifts which are not necessarily, they can turn neoliberalism into something ugly, but they're not necessarily a breakup. There are things which point to a breakup. There are two things. Firstly, since 2008, you all know, the economic recovery has been very slow compared to previous capitalist economic recoveries from slow. It's slow even compared to the slight recovery you get. In the mid-1930s, there was a recovery from the Great Slump that follows 1929, 1831, and it's then followed by another dip. It's actually bigger than anything you've had in the world since 2008. In particular, what's happened in 2008 is that world trade has ceased to grow faster than ever. Over the whole era, from 1945 to 2008, there are ups and downs, but world trade always grows quite markedly faster than ever. And that has stopped. That trend has stopped for the last 9 years. Then again, that whole era from 1945 was an era of more and more trade agreements, more and more agreements to free up trade. What we've seen in recent years, even before 2008, was the Doha round of the World Trade Organization. It's produced nothing except the Bali package, which is a very small bit of reforms. All that governments have turned to bilateral, not to world agreements, but to regional agreements between a few countries, like TTIP was going to be the TPP and so on, and TTIP and TPP are gone. The Chinese-based free trade agreement for Asia looks like going ahead, but it's a smaller thing than the TPP. Donald Trump talked about reversing NAFTA. The Canada-EU trade agreement got through in the end, but only by the skin of its teeth. There are trends which go back. So firstly, you have political trends which aren't quite great to neoliberalism, but sort of point in that direction. Then you have the facts about trade, which go back in substance to before 2008, which have led a lot of analysts to say, well, maybe this expansion of markets is coming to an end. Now, on that too, my surmise is I don't think this is necessarily a break from neoliberalism. Firstly, because what you have over the whole previous epoch is the development, the proliferation of these supply chains. So, the production of laptop computers, for example, comes to involve more and more contractors in more and more countries. Now, that may well be a finite process. Once you get to 20 countries, you stop. You don't go on to make it 30, 40, 50 countries. That doesn't mean that world markets have ceased to operate. It just means this is not an ongoing process which just continues in a straight line. It's a one-off movement from production, mostly centered in one country, to world supply chains which involve maybe 10, maybe 20 countries. Maybe that's just reached a plateau. The other thing which is certainly a factor in the figures is that that increase in world trade was overwhelmingly an increase in world trade in manufactured commodities, and manufactured commodities are a decreasing proportion of world trade. Services are becoming a greater proportion. The proportion of it's very difficult. It's a bit more difficult to work out with services whether there's an international supply chain. But it does, insofar as you work out figures, there are more and more of them where there is an international supply chain, where they are traded across borders, but it's still a lower proportion. So if you get a shift from manufacturing to services in world trade, that depresses the proportion of world trade to output, even though both in manufacturing and in services, it's still as globalised, or maybe more globalised than it was before. And the last fact is simply the reduction in the prices of many primary commodities, mainly oil and gas, and the development of fracking, similar technologies in the USA, which means the USA imports a lot less oil and gas. So it's quite a big difference to world trade figures, but it's not necessarily the collapse of that regime. So, finally, what does point to a possibility, and I don't know whether it's more of a possibility, of a breakup of the whole regime? And I think that is what is happening in the USA. Why the USA particularly? Because the USA's position in the world economy since 1945, and particularly in neoliberalism, has always been anomalous, in the sense that it's simultaneously the keystone of the whole international system. It's the keystone of all the international institutions that organise it and police it. It's the keystone of all of those. So, you know, the G20, the G7, the UN, the IMF, the WTO. The USA plays a central role in all these, yet in many ways, it's oddly, it's always been the least neoliberalised of the advanced capitalist countries. Now, if you think of neoliberalism as just being right-wing, that seems to make no sense. You know about healthcare, the USA, and so on. But, firstly, the US, for a whole year, has not been concerned with this, really not concerned with budget balancing at all. Every other government in the capitalist world is concerned with that. The US actually has never been particularly concerned with attracting capital from the rest of the world to come and purchase in the USA. Enough of them will come. We don't have to do anything to attract them. Every other government in the world, including the Chinese government, the German government, so on, is very concerned to make their country a good place for global capital. The US doesn't care so much. The US has the highest corporate tax rate of any advanced capitalist country. It used not to. It used to be average. It's now much higher than other countries. The US taxes rich people on their global income. None of the other advanced capitalist countries do that. And why does the US do that? Basically because it has more autonomy from the world markets than any other capitalist country. Because it's a bigger economy, so it has huge resources. Because trade is an increasing part of its output, but still much smaller than most other advanced capitalist countries. The Federal Reserve in the USA has always operated, it's never had the strict inflation targets other central banks have. Never had it. Federal Reserve acted in a much more unorthodox way in 2008 and more quickly than the other central banks which then followed. So it's always been simultaneously the keystone and the capitalist country least trammelled and least committed to neoliberalism. And I think that explains the emergence of Trump, and it explains how it is because it explains there is a large body of ruling class opinion and popular opinion in the USA which doesn't really care about all that stuff, which is happy to think of America first, which is not the case in other countries. So, for example, one of the things about the Brexit vote is you take polls and people vote for Brexit, so a huge minority say, well, yeah, but we'd really like to be in the single market. You look at the USA, there's hostility to immigrants. But the big thing that there's hostility to behind the Trump vote is trade. Brexit, Nobody saying we should have Brexit so there's less trade. Nobody is saying that. Not even the UK. Yeah? They're saying, right, well, Trump, we want to have less trade. Now, Vicky says I'm going to finish quickly. The question is, first, well, there's a question of what the limits are on Trump from the rest of the US ruling class. There's a question of what, of the limits on him from the circle around. There's a question of what he's really going for. Everybody knows, he reaches his Twitter account one day, the next day there's no coherence. But he is in a position whereby a relatively small set of decisions, basically to set up new protectionist barriers, because of the weight of the USA in the world system, he takes up the keystone of all the web of compromises, agreements, and so on, which have constituted that regime, and sets off a spiral of protectionism, which is what happened in the 1930s. The USA introduces the smoot-hauling tariff in 1930. The vast majority of economists, even of well-off opinion in the USA, is against it, but the government puts it through. That then sets off a spiral where it becomes the advantage of each government to introduce new protectionist measures. And with those protectionist measures goes a whole series of political consequences and a reinforcement of the sort of political trends I've talked about with Brexit and Le Pen. So, is that going to happen? I don't know. Is it worth looking at the possibilities? I think so. There is one political conclusion, which is we should definitively break from the idea that neoliberalism is the only possibility for capitalism, or if it's not the only possibility, it's certainly worse than anything else must be better. That's not true.